Welcome to a brief explanation of a third option for meeting Public Act 173 in terms of using growth and assessment data for teachers tied to the state assessment. As many of you likely know, Public Act 173 is both tight and loose. It's tight in its specific nature that it says currently 20% of the overall evaluation, that is half of the 40% that it's increasing in 2018-19. The legislation is loose on whether you apply the state growth and assessment data to a teacher based on the individual students that they taught, or whether you apply a group attribution, which might look like an entire grade level or a building attribution to teachers within your building. One thing that is universally accepted is that growth is defined by the same students across multiple points in time. So it is nearly impossible to measure third grade growth on the state assessment because that is a different group of third graders than the previous year, and we don't have any previous state data to measure how those students might have grown. So the question becomes, how do you use state level growth and assessment data, or in other words, how do you combine both growth and achievement data in a fair and equitable way for teachers? It might be helpful to touch upon some of the ways that we're currently measuring growth to get a better understanding of this third option, which is called adequate growth with standard error. This past winter, MDE introduced a new concept both on the parent dashboard and on the school index. On the parent dashboard, they showed us that their performance summary was the percent of students proficient in all subject areas, and that their progress summary was the percent of students who are making progress towards proficiency or maintaining proficiency. This is known as adequate growth. As you can see, this particular elementary school has 60% of their students maintaining or making progress towards proficiency. Compare that to similar schools, it's 56%. Compared to the state average, it's 40%. I concur with MDE's recommendation that we should not be using this measure for educator evaluations because it is an adequate growth percentile that is based on setting a target for a student growth percentile. In this case, if I looked at one particular content area, this school ranked at the 53rd percentile. Their average SGP was at the 53rd percentile for English language arts. When they set a target for every student on having a high enough SGP to maintain or be on track to obtain proficiency, they found that 62% of their students met the adequate growth percentile, or met that target that was set for the SGPs. A third option that was created by the Ottawa Area ISD looks at a criterion reference point in terms of adequate growth with a standard error. And for this particular school, for ELA, when you use the defaults that we established for adequate growth, you will see that 73% of students met adequate growth on the state assessment. And Simon Sinek would always tell us to start with the why rather than the what or the how. So let me explain a little bit about why we created a new system for measuring growth using standard error. To do this, we're going to look at some of the recommended cut scores based on the student growth percentiles. Now, this is a screenshot of a tool that IDEX had built using SGPs, and they give you some ability to set weights. For example, the recommended weight setting when we have a third year would be 20% on 2016, 30% on 2017, and 50% on 2018. It also allows you to set cut scores on what effective and highly effective might be. So if you're above the 60th percentile with your average SGPs, you would receive highly effective. If you're between 40 and 60%, you would receive effective. If you're between 20 and 40%, you would receive minimally effective, and below 20 percentile, you would receive ineffective. So if we think of a group of students that are in the 60s for their SGP, we might think of how much a highly effective teacher grew those students. And if we think of a student that's in the 20s, we might think of how a minimally effective teacher might have grown those students. The problem with SGPs is they work great with a large number when you have consecutive testing, but at the high school level, they tend to fall apart a little bit, and there are anomalies because it works for the majority of students, but maybe not well for all students. So if you would, imagine what you might think a student's progress might look like at the 65th percentile and at the 28th percentile. Starting with the 65th percentile, here is a sample of a student in the not proficient category in 6th grade that was 33 points below proficiency, yet they were in the 65th percentile for their SGP, their student growth percentile. So we might reconcile this with the fact that they were really low the year before. But when I go and look at this student's 5th grade score, I notice that they were about in the same position. In fact, they were 34 points below proficiency, where now they're 33 points below proficiency. But clearly, they are still not proficient. Yet, their SGP is at the 65th percentile. Another area where we might see an anomaly is when a student scores very high in the advanced level. In fact, this margin of error here says that on a different day they could have had a perfect score. But yet, they're at the 28th percentile for their SGP. The reason for that is because the year before they did have a perfect score, and this year they missed a couple of problems. With these type of anomalies, it made us ask the question, is there a better way to measure growth from one state assessment to another state assessment? In other words, if a student was right on the border of advanced and proficient and they dropped to proficient, would we really count that as not growing because technically they scored within their same margin of error? Or what if the student dropped even more so that now, even if I looked at their margin of error, this confidence interval, we could clearly say that they certainly declined because not even on their best day would they have scored similar to their worst day the year before. So as we look at something like these student profiles that we get based on the state assessment, we might consider how can we use this margin of error, this confidence interval, to determine whether a student made adequate growth. We decided that if a student was proficient, or at least close enough to proficient, provided they didn't drop significantly, they were on track to maintain proficiency, and we counted them as meeting adequate growth. If the student was not even close to proficient, or in that not proficient category, we would say that the student would have had to likely improved in order to close the gap towards proficiency. One way that we can define likely improving is if they scored greater than this confidence interval that you see on these M-STEP reports. These are set to 1 standard error. So if they scored greater than that 1 standard error, we could say that they likely improved. Therefore, we set up the following criteria for meeting adequate growth with standard error. We first asked, is the student proficient, or at least close enough? If the student's not even close to proficiency, then we said the only way to meet adequate growth if they're likely improving. And we define likely improving by more than 1 standard error from 1 year to the next. If the student was proficient, or at least close enough, of course they met adequate growth if they continued to improve, but we're going to allow them to meet adequate growth as long as they maintained a reasonable level as well. The only way we would not count them is if they certainly declined. But instead of looking at only 1 standard error, in terms of declining, they had to decline more than 2 standard errors for us to not count them as meeting adequate growth. Therefore, in this way, we are combining both proficiency and growth to better represent the intent of the law that we should measure state growth and assessment data. And you can see this paralleled in other sections of the law where they want a heavy emphasis on both growth and proficiency.